Now, let's start the last presentation. Excuse me, this is an excursion. I'd like to recall someone who can't show up here today because of personal reasons, who has input into the success of this THR meeting successfully. So, my regards to Ángeles Montada, chair of ANSVAP, who can be with us today. Let me now introduce Attila Danko, a GP in Ballarat, Australia, an experienced GP, and he will discuss this topic, I Have a Dream. The floor goes to Attila Danko from Ballarat, Australia.
Thank you. I smoked from the age of 11, and I was also a medical doctor and still am. And so this brought me a lot of shame, but no matter what I could do, I couldn't give up. 19 years ago, my first baby was born, Mia. And as I was holding her and just feeling this amazing love, like a love that I'd never experienced in my life, I was horrified by the idea that I'd be reeking of this toxic smell to that beautiful, sensitive nose that she had. And so with a great deal of determination and tons of nicotine patches and gum, I did manage to give up smoking for about 6 months. Then I'd go to a barbecue or some other gathering, there'd be people smoking, and I'd say, oh, just give me one of those. And you know, even long after withdrawal symptoms have gone, I still wanted a smoke. And I'd get one of these smokes, I'd take it and it's like the most wonderful thing in the world. And my baby grew. And she used to say, Daddy, Daddy, let's go on an adventure. And we'd take her on hikes through the bush. We'd find little seeds of trees, we'd make little holes and bury them and dream of the trees that would grow in 20 years' time. And I was back to smoking. And I remember one day sitting in my car having a cigarette and just thinking, why can't I give up these bloody things? You know, it's going to kill me early. And I was just thinking about my daughter, imagining her, you know, ripping her heart out over the daddy she loved so much, dying an early death. And I just started bawling my eyes out because I was so trapped by smoking. So vaping came along and it was like a miracle. I could quit. I could switch to something else. And you know, I mean, I felt so relieved and so liberated by this. But in Australia, nicotine for vaping is treated the same as heroin, with the same sorts of penalties, which was just outrageous for me. Outrageous that me saving my own life, saving the heartbreak of my daughter, was a crime. And more than this, in the whole world, 7 million people die every year from smoking. It's a holocaust. Every bloody year. I rejected this with every fibre of my being. I cannot stand another husband grieving over the grave of his wife, another son grieving over the grave of his mother, another daughter grieving over the grave of her father. And as we see in the world, cigarette consumption is still going up. Numbers of smokers in the world are still going up. And the forecast with business as usual, you know, if we get all the FCTC recommendations implemented, if we get the toughest tobacco control, maybe we might see these sorts of curves of gradual slow decline. But if you look at Australia, I mean, we've done all of that. I mean, we have eye-watering 12.5% increases in taxes compounding every year. You know, a cigarette is now almost €1, one cigarette. And the toughest smoke-free laws in the world. Smokers are treated like lepers. And we've got information just from last week that the smoking rates have actually just increased slightly. And this is over a 5-year period. We've had stagnant smoking rates. Countries which allow tobacco harm reduction, albeit limited ways and with restrictions, like the US and the UK, are now well below Australia. The end game of the tobacco control establishment, what they dreamed about in some journal articles a few years ago, was that we'd have an end game by 2030. You've got to be joking. Not using the same methods that you're using in Australia. It's not going to happen. These slides are borrowed from one of Clive's presentations, and he makes a much better case for another different way of moving this curve, not trying to move the total nicotine consumption curve, but rather moving the risky nicotine consumption curve away from the low-risk nicotine consumption curve. And maybe by 2030, we might get 50%, which would be an amazing public health win. But in his talk, he was talking about that these sorts of curves require implausible declines, catastrophic declines. And as I was preparing for this speech, I was thinking, well, what if it were possible? What if we could have a catastrophe for cigarettes? Is it so implausible? After all, digital photography was, film photography was riding high in the year 2000. Kodak was king of the hill. 7 years later, it was obsolete because it was a no-brainer. Marilyn Monroe died in 1962 from a barbiturate overdose, which was the common sedative used at the time. In 1963, diazepam was licensed for sale. In a few years, barbiturate prescriptions basically didn't exist anymore. If Marilyn had lived for a couple more years, she'd still probably be alive today. I remember working in ICU as a doctor and having a patient who took 50 diazepam tablets. She just needed a bit of respiratory support. 24 hours later, she was discharged. So why is it that we can't get the same catastrophic declines, the same sorts of obsolescence once a no-brainer thing comes along? Well, this is the reason. And you laugh, and I do too. But honestly, people with this framework of thinking, they honestly believe that promiscuous sex is worse than dying from AIDS. One leads to temporary suffering, but the other leads to eternal suffering. So it makes sense within their framework. In the same way, people in the tobacco control establishment, they honestly believe that nicotine is the evil. Nicotine is the problem. It enslaves people. It gets people going back to an industry which feeds off their misery. It layers evil upon evil upon evil. And they think that the suffering of a few old smokers dying is a small price to pay if we can prevent a generation of new young addicts from arising through vaping. The end justifies the means, and they don't listen or understand. Indeed, they've made it the very foundation of their faith, their most sacred and holy Article 5.3. Thou shalt not listen or try to understand under pain of heresy and banishment anyone from a pro-nicotine industry, any pro-nicotine scientists, and even pro-nicotine consumers. Without this rule, their whole rotten edifice of their religion would collapse. I believe in another faith, that the most important thing to do is to listen and understand. And yes, I do this with people who might look like enemies too. I try and understand the tobacco control establishment. And this is actually our secret power that the fanatics do not have. The power of making supposed enemies into our friends. Because there are lots of people in the middle of this argument, of this controversy, who are increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of jailing ordinary consumers in Thailand, for example, treating vaping like heroin in Australia, multi-year prison sentences for a small-time vape vendor in India. And this is why the ordinary consumer is the most powerful force we have. It's easy to dismiss the industry because they can say that, well, their motive is profit. They can dismiss the scientists because the scientists' effort to understand the industry breaks their sacred rule. But it's very hard to dismiss an ordinary consumer whose only possible motive is to save their own lives. You know, I'm one of Simon Chapman's most ardent disciples. I read his books religiously. And in his books he talks about how powerful the story of the ordinary consumer is. It's something he's emphasised again and again, and I've taken his lesson to heart. Because this is what they're terrified of. They're terrified of Andrew Thompson. They're terrified of Charles Yates, of Annette Huppert's, Laurie and Jolly. They're terrified of waitresses, truck drivers, cleaners and single mums. Because he knows the power of personal stories, the power of ordinary people. We had an e-cigarette inquiry in Australia, and we made it our mission to get as many personal, emotive stories into this submission as possible. I mean, a lot of these people hadn't even written a letter to the editor before, and they were terrified of writing their personal submission. They were courageous. Just think, they were basically telling the government, a big scary government commission, hey, I'm a criminal here, hear my story. And yet they did, in their hundreds. And then, I don't know whether it was incompetence or malice, but there came an email from a major tobacco company, its little email list. And it was towards the end of the period of submission time, and they wrote an email, exhorting their little list of people who were, defending the rights of smokers to write it in their personal story, if they were vapers, into the inquiry. And this was just gold for our opponents. They loved this. They grabbed that story. They went to major newspapers, and these were the front page headlines in Australian newspapers. They were defaming the courage of these ordinary vapers. I mean, it was just, I think this is unforgivable. It's one thing to have a debate. We can have an honest debate, and that's fair. But to stoop to this level, that is just disgusting. I was president of the New Nicotine Alliance consumer group, advocacy group, for 3 years. We worked hard, putting in submissions, talking to media, talking to politicians, doing everything we could. I did this without any pay. The effort ended my marriage, it ended my career, and it even alienated my daughter. But we still appeared to be many years away. The establishment appeared too strong, and I just couldn't do it anymore. I felt like I'd burnt out, I'd failed. But then one morning, I woke up and realised, you know what? I can actually legalise nicotine myself. I've got that power. And I've always had that power because I'm a doctor and I can write prescriptions. And so as I started to talk about this idea, other people put me in contact with Ryan Bolton. But the principle of this is that the drug war warriors for cannabis never held out for the perfect victory. They were happy with incremental progress. They pushed for and won and celebrated medical marijuana as a stepping stone to full legalisation as a consumer product. And we already had the laws which allowed us to do this. By following certain regulations and working out a process, we could do this. And so I ended up, after the accusations of being an industry shill, well, I actually am now. I've joined this company. Ryan, who was the founder of this, he'd been working for 2 years as well. He'd faced similar struggles, similar hardships, and and it was difficult. I had to accept the stigmatisation of being an industry. Also, potentially attacks from vaping advocacy friends who felt that I was doing a half-assed measure that wasn't, what the true believers would want. But I just couldn't accept that we would continue this way, that people were dying now, and I couldn't wait for years. And so, I've been reinvigorated by this, and now I'm in this dynamic team of amazing people, and we're going to put out this medicalised vaping product, which is still going to have flavours. It's going to be something which is highly consumer acceptable, and we're just going to try and get it out as much as we possibly can. You know, the vaping industry really does need to grow up in some ways. We need to stop putting out products with kiddie cartoons. We do need to make sure that we keep these products out of the hands of children without taking away the important things like flavours and effective nicotine delivery. In a way, you could say we're not really a company promoting a specific product, but more like a commercial stop smoking service. We're going to be ploughing any profits back into further development, improving our device, making it as safe as possible, as effective as possible. We want to engage with the regulators. We want to put our products into trials, test the admissions, anticipate any problems. And when we do all this, we know there are lots of people in the middle, because I've talked to them, and they see no problem with our model. It's going to divide the tobacco community even further. And the ones who are left even opposing what we do will be seen as really frothing mouth fanatics. And I look forward to that. Here are some of the, this is the sort of nicotine delivery profile that we need and we're going to achieve. And here are some of the exponential curves that we need for a catastrophe for cigarettes. You know, new devices that have come out in recent years in America and Japan have been creating 12.5% per annum decreases in smoking. Unprecedented, compounded over 2 years in Japan. These are the sort of exponential curves that we need for a catastrophe for cigarettes, and that really excites me. You know, Elon Musk never dreamed of making billions of dollars. That's not what he went into business for. He wanted to go to Mars. His vision is of humanity reaching out beyond the bonds of gravity, of humanity becoming interplanetary. His business is simply the best vehicle he can find to achieve his dreams. And that's me too. I'm in this vehicle now to be part of the movement to save 1 billion lives. And I'd ask you all, just consider what is the best vehicle for you. Maybe where you're working is really great. Maybe you can develop an even better team. Because we're all working at different angles at the same problem. And that's a really great thing. Where's my slide? That's all right. No, there's another slide. In Australia, I'm only just getting started. The perfect storm is building. Pent-up demand like no other country. Maybe 2% of the nicotine market has been penetrated so far. The pressures have been building and building. The damn wall is groaning under the pressure. This incredible public health prize, the biggest one in history, the true end of smoking, the end of the Holocaust, is so close. I can taste it. I can feel it. Even though it seems dark, I think that we are almost there. Because if we can bust open the Australian market, it has global implications. Because Australia is the spiritual home of the anti-nicotine project. If they can't win there, where can they win? If they can't hold there, they can't hold anywhere. Make no mistake, we face huge obstacles, massive entrenched interests, powerful lobbies and organisations that are completely satisfied with business as is. We face our own fears of being cut off and shut out and rejected by the establishment that brands us as shills, as heretics, for daring to dream of a different way. We dream of a catastrophe for cigarettes, a massive tectonic shift in the forecast of 1 billion lives lost. And we know how it will be done, and we know that it can be done. Not through prohibition, but through the enjoyment of something better. Not through being controlled, but by people taking the power back into their own hands. For we will win, because we fight against smoke, instead of fighting against nicotine. That's why we will win, because we fight for people's lives, instead of fighting to protect an ideology. That's why we will win, because we embrace the power of markets and industry, instead of being ruled by inflexible, inhumane, obsolete rules that have long outlived their usefulness. We embrace the future, not the past. That's why we will win, because we sit and listen and understand. We build coalitions and alliances. Our mission is sensible, realistic, and a no-brainer. That's why we will win, because we embrace the sins of our shared, flawed humanity. We don't demand the terrifying purity and abstinence that no one could possibly live up to. That's why we will win, because in the face of the smoker, we see ourselves. Thank you.
And we will win because we have bases. We have, I would say, las bases in English.
The evidence.
No, ground.
Grassroots.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
And the other, and in fact, at least in many countries, the opponents are empty shells.
Yeah.
Are lobbies.
Yeah.
Are lobbies. We trace one of these. We trace them. It was nothing spectacular police work. We just went to a notary and find out. And this organization, which pictures itself as a civil organization, its official address is a lobbying company. So this, in many cases, we're facing lobbies without people, without soldiers, without. There's an English word for that. That. And unfortunately, in some countries, these people do have bases.
Yeah.
Like, for example, especially in the English-speaking world, the epicenter, California, the East Coast in the U.S., they do have bases. They do have people.
Yeah, they've got a political machine that's very strong. Yeah.
Yes, it's strong. And but on the whole, this movement has a consumer basis that it's there is pragmatic, and this is, I think, the main reason why in the end we will win.
Yeah. Yeah, if one door's closed, we can find another door.
I forgot that